Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
I'm on with Danny Newcombe, who has been recently been on Rob Gray's Perception and Action podcast. Highly recommend checking that out for a conversation because there's an awful lot of really high quality information in there. But Danny and I both work in the hockey landscape, both been working within the talent space, and have done quite a bit of coach development, coach education sessions together. I feel very sorry for the people who were on our courses because it was complete chaos, but in the best possible way. Danny, welcome. Why don't you tell everybody about yourself?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Stu. So main role or the day job is senior lecturer in sport coaching and physical education at Oxford Brookes University. Really run the coaching strand that runs through our degree. Other jobs include assistant coach for Hockey Wales, so the men and the 21s. Have been doing that for about 5 years. Head coach at Southgate Hockey Club Men. Do a lot of CPD stuff for coaches across schools, clubs, in and out of hockey as well. And then doing a PhD as well in environment design with Keith Davies and Ian Renshaw. So, yeah, enough to keep me out of trouble.
And that, so I was going to say, so what do you do on the other 5 days?
Yeah. Sleep when you're dead.
So basically, what you and I get together periodically. We'll chew the fat over various things happening within the world of talent development, within coaching, and all these sorts of things. Keen to just sort of, I guess, what's going on in your world at the moment, what's challenging you at the moment, and what sort of things are interesting you as well. Yeah.
So obviously, previously the kind of environment design framework was something we produced to bridge the gap between theory and practice, to push people from, and I did something on the kind of the evolution of your practice design, and I think most of us probably been through this cycle from kind of drill-based practices through to kind of generic small-sided games, through to then kind of affordance-driven practices across the continuum, which was basically the kind of environment design stuff. How do we design practices with more purpose that are it's going to transfer to the game? And then kind of tapping on the end now with my PhD, looking at how we manage practices in relation to the life form in front of us, which is really kind of some really interesting stuff around optimal grip, fields of affordances, and kind of life forms, which is quite philosophical and a little bit fluffy, but some of the stuff really links in. So they talked about life form being a species, and that species having a niche, and therefore only certain affordances being open, or opportunities for action being open to that life form. And as a coach, you need to understand the species and then provide the right opportunities for action. So it'd be like offering meat to a vegetarian and wondering why they wouldn't eat it. It's the wrong species. They're not going to interact with that affordance. So I think in the environment design framework, I'll give you an example. We talked about providing optimal amount of chaos for learning, or the optimal amount of instability for them to organize against. And then it gets to a deeper layer of how much instability in your session, across the session, per week. How much in the one just before your game and how much in the one earlier in the week. Can you periodize that instability over a week or a month or, across a season? So we're really responding to the group in front of you, what their life form is, and how much instability they can kind of tolerate, process. The guys who play for Southgate, a lot of them come out of the city, up the Jubilee line, travel an hour. They get there, having been up since whatever time. It's a different amount of instability for them than it is for the guys who arrive on camp, sleep, eat, and breathe hockey for 3 days. So yeah, there's definitely some stuff around taking that environment design framework and then applying it to the life form in front of us and really managing those affordances.
Is a simpler, sorry to interrupt, but is a simpler way, in my kind of simple way of what you describe as a species, that's an individual with a set of environmental, personal, personality-led, kind of, they've got a certain makeup that kind of makes who they are as, I suppose, as a species, and therefore dealing with them on an individual level based on their wants and needs is kind of what you're talking about there, or have I oversimplified? Because I'm always guilty of that. Yeah,
I think so. We'll always end up as respond to the individual, which I think is an excuse some coaches use for doing pretty much anything. So, yeah, I think we have to take it's a slightly broader look at the group in front of you, I think, and what their life form is, and recognising that they're all individuals and they'll all need individual sort of constraint manipulation, and they all have their different development focuses and needs. But as a group, I think you manage the affordances for them. The guys turn up for an hour and a half on a Thursday night. They don't want a session that's stop-start, that's got lots of dead time in it, that's that's got long discussions around things. They want to feel like they've done something ready to play on Saturday. So I use constraints to manipulate those practices for them, and there's certain practices that I like but won't work for these guys because that's not their life form. So,
can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so we might do quite a little bit of 1v1 work now. So with the Welsh guys, because we're looking at technical development, so lower down the continuum. It's a little bit less high intensity. It's a little bit less chaotic, and it takes we're looking at real mastery and focus within it. I can't use as much as that with the Southgate guys because they want to feel like they've had a charge around. In really simple terms, and they want to feel like they're ready for the game of the weekend. So we're lucky with the Welsh guys because we might have a 3-day camp and have 6 sessions, so we can afford for one of them to be there. And manipulating the instability is a nice one because the one-on-one stuff actually is sort of cognitively easier to process. There's less chaos for them. So actually, I don't think you can overload the chaos too much in a session. So even simple things like having 3 new practices in a session, I'm not sure how much quality development you'll get. Having 3 real high stress, high cognitive practices that involve real quick transitions, lots of players. I think you can have 2 of those in a session or 1 of them, but I don't think you can fill your entire hour and a half or 2 hours with that type of practice because you'll just overload them. So it's really getting into the kind of detail and moving past the principles and really looking at your practice, I think, is one area I'm massively interested in at the minute.
So, I'm interested in that. I've got loads of questions, but so I totally buy into the idea, by the way, of limiting the number of practices that you put in. I think when I was first coming into this landscape, I think like a lot of coaches. And a number of people listening to this could well be in the early stages of their coaching journey and just interested in this new way of working. And I think the tendency is you want to always create something new and shiny for each single session, and quite often you want to move from one thing to the next in order to get. But actually, in many ways, even from session to session, you're sometimes better off sticking with something similar until it becomes familiar enough that actually you've lowered the stress, because initially, like you say, lots of instability, lots of stress, they're getting used to it. By week 3, week 4, they're very used to the idea, and then that's when you can start to layer in different things. I think people generally move on a bit too quick, don't they?
Yeah, and I think that's the art, knowing when to move on, knowing when it's become too stable that there's no reorganisation coming.
Mm. I think the other thing for me as well is one of the things I've got really interested in as well is how we can. The point to move on should be determined by whether the players can take whatever it is we've been learning and apply it within the full chaos of the full game. And if you don't see evidence of that, then realistically, you probably shouldn't move on.
Yeah, and that's the stuff we've been developing within the continuum. So the practice design continuum, which basically within hockey starts with 1v1 at one end and then builds up to your macro game 8v8, 11v11. And the kind of some of our secondaries did an amazing job with their assessments this week of ensuring that the affordances, so the opportunities for action, the triggers and cues, were the same in terms of kind of distance, speed of pass, variability of pass, from their 1v1 practice through into their kind of macro 11v11 game. Mm-hmm. And they managed to move them up the continuum. So they start with some 1v1, then into some 3v3 stuff to increase the chaos and the variability. Then into a small-sided game, which was sort of 5v5, 6v6, where they kept the triggers and cues the same, and then into an 11v11 macro game. Like, the kind of transfer went from 1v1 to 3v3 to 5v5 quite well. When it went from 5v5 to kind of 8v8, then that's when we lost them as a group. And I still don't think, because obviously the ultimate aim of all of our training needs to be, does it transfer? Will it change behaviour in a game? Will it bring about a better execution, a better decision when it really matters? I still think we do a lot of stuff, and it's always the question I ask coaches is it's a nice practice, but will it transfer? Is the best question you can always ask yourself. Has it changed their behaviour?
Yeah, I've heard you say that one before, so drilling into that a little bit more. I mean, you've mentioned the practice design continuum. It might be worth just kind of explaining what that looks like for people. I call it the funnel of variability, but it's all the same sort of stuff really. So explain what you mean by that for people.
Yeah. So if you imagine a normal graph, bottom left would be a more technical emphasis and a reduced amount of players sort of adapting, so I call it in kind of personal coordination. But I still try and sit to make it contextualized, to make it representative, so include a direction, include a defender. But it will look more like 1v1 down that end. As you head up the continuum, basically it's the increasing number of players that are co-adapting. Mm-hmm. In really simple terms, a practice can be 1v1, 2v2. As you move into unit play, that might move into 3v3. And the names are just semantics. It's not really important. But you might move into unit play, and then you might go into some small-sided games, which include transitions into sort of 4v4, 5v5, and then you move into kind of macro game stuff from 8v8 to 11v11. Obviously, as you move up the continuum, there's more players in the practice, which probably decreases the technical emphasis. Not that there isn't one, but there's just less goes. So if you're playing in an 8v8 versus a 2v2, you're going to touch the ball less. It's just law of averages, really. But that doesn't mean you're not getting more of a tactical emphasis. So you're making more decisions tactically about movement off the ball, team defense. We're trying to coordinate as an 8 or an 11. So it's about, and I would say it's not a continuum that you try and just slide up. You need to kind of play around and hit different points on it at different times depending on what your development focus is. So you might start with a small-sided game, recognise there's a technical element that needs developing which is really holding them back, go switch straight to a 1v1 practice to get that repetition technically but still representative, and then you might move back up to a small-sided game, and then you might move then to some unit play. So it's up to the coach's job really to pick the optimum position on the continuum based on what they want to develop.
Yeah. So if you're happy with me doing this, I'll actually put I'll put a link in the show notes to a slide from one of your presentations that you use within our Coaching for Talent workshops within England Hockey, which actually has the practice design continuum. If you're comfortable with me doing that, I'll put that so that people can find that on the website if they want to search it out and they get a rough idea of what that looks like.
Yeah, and the idea behind it started was that we wanted to move people away from this approach is just small-sided games, which I think was where it ended up a little bit. And it can be 8v8 and it can be 1v1. How you then explain that practice to bring around development needs. So within our 8v8s we do a lot of scenario training. We do a lot of you're 1-0 down, 8 minutes to go. How do you play? Now you've lost a player. How do we deal with playing players up, players down? So we recreate those game-like scenarios within that kind of macro game, which gives more meaning to what they're doing within it.
So I think one of the reasons I call it the funnel of variability is because I see it as a genuinely three-dimensional funnel, almost like a cyclone or a torpedo almost. And the further up the cyclone you go, the more obviously the more chaotic it is because things are moving at real high speed and what have you. And the reason I see it as three-dimensional is because the practice design or the practice type obviously has different levels of variability within, like you say, a pretty isolated, 1v1. 1v1 has quite a high level of variability actually, but let's take a 1v1 as an example versus an 8v8. There's obviously quite a significant difference. But if you manipulate, like you say, you manipulate space or you manipulate kind of rules around tasks and things like that, then obviously, as you say, you can slide up and down that funnel a little bit by reducing some of the informational cues that are coming in. So whilst it's still the same game, it's not exactly on the same level within the funnel. It slides down slightly, and obviously skillful manipulations of those mean that you can bring about different behavioural changes in the participants.
Yeah, so for me, it's all about instability, and that can come in many different ways. So just manipulating the ball feed positions and the distance of pass in a 1v1 will change the instability within that 1v1 practice. So yeah, they do overlap in terms of instability. The instability is different. You've got to have instability if you want self-organisation and reorganisation. So you've got to provide that. It's just a different type of instability down one end and at the other end, which is why sort of someone said to me, why don't you call it representative at one end and sort of more, less representative or closed at the other? And the 1v1 still has to be representative. That's the answer. So that doesn't separate them either. A little bit of increase in variability. But then when we try to push this across to other sports, so say something really at the other end of the sort of spectrum, like a swimming or athletics, chatting to their coaches, the top end of their continuum is race execution. You get one dive, you get one go at performing. That's their kind of macro game, if you like.
Yeah.
And then as they move down the continuum, they move down towards more specific drill-based practices that might relate to a certain part of the stroke, and so forth. So in tennis, playing full games and sets is definitely their macro game. And as they slide back down, they might move to competitive points. They might move to, different things around court, how much of the court, how much the feed is predictable. So it will look different in every context. But the top end of every continuum, I think, needs to look like or closer to what the actual performance environment is.
So as you know, I've been out there at the moment, talking about the role of the isolated drill in the coaching context, and I'm still convinced, and yet to be convinced otherwise, that actually. Particularly in a dynamic sport where an opponent is in place, that there's a need, as much as is possible, to develop the skill with an opponent of some kind in place, so that the movement pattern learned in isolation, and goes back to this point of transferability, it's much more transferable if the movement pattern is learned with the the kind of visual cue of an opponent, as opposed to without any form of opponent whatsoever and trying to run round a cone or something along those lines. How does that fit in with what you're talking about?
Yeah, so don't disagree. That's the kind of utopia. Making everything contextual, making sure the triggers and cues are relevant. I think that's why the 1v1 stuff is where we've shifted back towards it a little bit more. So cleverly positioned player start position, speed positions will bring about you want to hit a reverse stick cross. We can cleverly constrain the start positions of the defender and attacker to facilitate that being the answer, but there's still that kind of trigger and cue of a defender and of a forward to pass to. So that I still think though, there's and I've been the kind of latest stuff we've been looking at is kind of the human movement end of the spectrum, and around attractor wells and how we deepen them, and there probably is still a place for taking 100 balls down the AstroTurf on your own and going and hitting 100 backhands. For that kind of mastery end of the spectrum to build those attractor wells. I'm just not sure, because of the short amount of time we have with them on a pitch, that we can use that time in our training sessions. You always hear it, only the best players stick around after training. Have you read any of the Bosch stuff around?
Yeah, I just shared some of that on Twitter recently.
Yeah, so around the tractors and building those. I think there's a nuanced approach to how we constrain the practice to promote reorganisation, and I think that's where the constraints come in. Things around external attention being really important. I think, and understanding what the fixed principles for that movement are and promoting those kind of key positions, and then being able to ignore the ones that don't break those. There's a whole load of work there that needs sort of articulating. I think Bosch does a really good job on it, but I think the integration between that kind of human movement skill development and then transfer into the game is a really interesting area for us as practitioners to really solve. I've heard things like players have earned the right to drill, so they've played enough games, they know what good feels like, so they can go down the Astro and hit 100 balls because they know what it feels like when they get it right. The kind of with juniors, kind of human behaviour stuff, if the environment doesn't require them to push it hard because there's no defender, then they won't. So there's definitely an argument there. But we, with the Welsh guys, got to a point now where it's execution which is really separating us from breaking into that top tier. Mm. So we'll do everything right. We'll put the ball in the right channel. We'll manipulate them tactically. We'll time our leads perfectly. We'll put someone away and they'll hit the cross. Or they'll mistrap the ball at that key moment. So we're really kind of reflecting now on how do we get our guys to execute when they only get 3 of those a game. It's a bit like a slip fielder only gets 2 catches a game, or 1 catch a game. How do you practice creating that 1 catch? So those are the kind of key questions I'm really having around our coaching and the role of kind of unopposed practice versus opposed practice. I would always say, as much as possible, make it opposed, as much as possible, make it a 1v1, but they still need to hit 100 backhands. So the balance between the two, I guess, is the key issue. Yeah,
and I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that sort of describe kind of unopposed activity as being it's a little bit like salt. Don't use too much of it. Otherwise it's bad for you, or junk food. Not too bad for you every now and again, but don't have it all the time. Otherwise it becomes a bit unhealthy. But I want to share with you a hypothesis I have, and I think you've alluded to this, which is, let's talk about children and the development of young people. And I see lots and lots of young people doing this kind of very isolated, so-called technical development activity without context. And my hypothesis is that it's just not very engaging and it's just not very much fun. So obviously, people sort of assume that what I then am suggesting is that we go down the other end and we just play games all the time. And as Rod Thorpe said to me once, playing games is better than doing drills, but it's not much better. If that's all you do. So it's like anything, take the extremes and only do games. Like you say, you don't get enough goes. However, I do think, my point being is that I think for a long time we've thought, right, you've got to develop the technical capabilities to do the tactical things, and then the tactical, and actually before that you've got to develop the physical capabilities to do the technical things, and then the technical capabilities to do the tactical things. I actually think it's the other way around. So I think that kids should spend a lot of time playing because I think they should appreciate what the game is asking them to do. And from there, obviously, various solutions will naturally emerge, but various solutions won't naturally emerge, and that's when we can constrain down and actually say, tell you what, we're going to do 100 backhands today, or whatever it might be, because we're going to try and use those into a game and transfer them. But where possible, again, I still think there's a place to try and find, well, okay, we're going to do 100 backhands, but let's just do 100 backhands with someone in the vicinity who, if you don't quite get it right, might nick it off you. So there's always that cue for you to use, so that then it does transfer. That's my rant over.
If it's not on the menu, I always talk about if it's not on the menu. So if you're not confident hitting a backhand, in an environment that's dynamic, they probably won't choose to hit a backhand, which means they don't get any better at hitting a backhand. Yeah. So I think the tendency for coaches then is to fall into kind of the over-constraining trap and say, you've got to hit a backhand in a complex environment. But what they're probably doing then is attaching the decision to hit a backhand with the wrong triggers and cues. Yeah. So the key for me is can you provide the right triggers and cues by carefully manipulating your 1v1 practice for them to hit the backhand. Yeah. So they're attaching that to the right triggers and cues. I think it's really important. So they're going on how do you add it to the menu without over constraining them is a really big question, I think.
So that technique selection is really important in terms of a decision-making capacity, because for me, I see lots and lots of players. Let's just talk about backhand in hockey. It's the new thing, isn't it? And you've got a generation of kids who are better at hitting the ball on their backhand than they are on their forehand. But what I see a lot of is, players going to the backhand when a forehand option is available to them that potentially could have been more effective as an opportunity. So therefore, what that suggests to me is they're not choosing that technical solution based on environmental cues. They're just doing it.
Yeah, the trigger and cue for an action, an action needs to come from the environment. It can't come from the itself. Yeah. Then you'll actually build that coupling.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting area. Still one that I'm working on. But my challenge, I think, is if we can just be a bit more creative and just create a little bit of an environmental, so add in just an element of variability with some form of opposition, whether it's direct or whatever, then actually we make the activity far more engaging. Therefore, more kids enjoy it, and we can develop that skill component as well.
Yeah, and I tried something on a weekend with the Welsh guys where we just did a bit of I just wanted to try it. Unopposed hitting, and when they've got the time and they can put the ball where they want to put it, and there's no rush, they can hit off both sides comfortably, execute sort of 9 times out of 10. It's a ball feed that comes to them that doesn't then get trapped and put exactly where they want it, but because the defender's there, they've got to hit it anyway. Is when they struggle. Yeah. So that your point around the variability and the kind of representative of the environment is so important. Is how do we provide that whilst getting them enough goes at doing the execution that we want them to do to build those attractor wells. That's the real key challenge.
Yeah. I mean, with the international guys, like you say, you can spend time doing that, and they will attend to it over a period of time. But like with your club standard, even though it's a high level of club standard play, like you say, they're more interested in getting out there and making things happen. So spending a good chunk of time on that sort of technical development is not something that they would engage with for that long, is it?
Yeah, and the other key thing with it, if you're on your own and you're hitting a backhand or a forehand or an aerial or whatever it is in hockey, if you're overthinking about a certain body part or trying to get your hips here or your hands there, you're kind of overriding the self-organisation process. So, which we want to try and make as unconscious as possible. So, obviously the ball provides an external kind of focus of attention, but the defender does as well. And also where we're trying to hit the ball. provides us with a kind of an external focus. So we need to include those if we can, because otherwise we're overriding that self-organisation process. And then when that transfers to a game, well, it won't, because they don't have time to think about hand position or knee position, because the more I read around kind of human movement, it's kind of decentrally controlled, and we need to kind of allow that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's loads of research coming out all the time, isn't it? It's a really fascinating area of development. It's actually fascinating to almost be, I feel to me like the world of coaching and the academic world are almost exactly level with each other in terms of progressing this area of development on. It's almost like the practitioner is leading the academic discussion.
Yeah, which is, well, all good theory comes from practice anyway. So that's the key thing to kind of remember, is that these models for learning, for frameworks for how we create skill and reorganise have come from people watching practice. The problem is they're then presented in probably an inaccessible way, which sort of provides, creates the barrier, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is but there's a thirst for it and there's a real appetite. I mean, you've seen it as much as I have when you go out there and you're working with early stage coaches, people very much at the sort of starting point of their coaching career. They're actually quite enthused by the approach, and actually it takes a little bit of the pressure off them in some respects, because they're like, it's not just about actually having the perfect technique. It's actually about allowing kids to explore various ways of solving a problem.
Yeah, I mean, even with the project we're doing in primary schools, we go in and train teachers who, some have a PE background, but some really don't. So they're kind of, they're really interested in how children develop generally. So when we're helping them understand how a child develops their kind of physical literacy, that they actually get really engaged, and because they genuinely care about the development of the child. So the same way they develop their numeracy or their kind of literacy, they get engaged because they feel like they've got something they can really grab hold of and use, rather than just regurgitating drill-based practices or PE-based practices which they've had before.
Which is, it must feel quite liberating and actually more pedagogical, I suppose, to be able to work in that way.
Yeah, when you just tell them it's no different to any other lesson, it's just got a different curriculum, they tend to really engage and get on board, which is great. There's pockets of excellent work. There's definitely a shift happening. There's a lack of empirical evidence, which I definitely agree with, but whether this approach works or not. But then there's also the research within skill acquisition is all very lab-based and not representative, so there's a huge issue there for researchers to solve around how we prove this stuff works, or how we prove what's effective and what's not. When we're working in an environment that's so complex, and then in order to measure stuff, we have to reduce that down. It doesn't really fit. So that's definitely an area for the research world that needs to really attend to. But going in and living and breathing this stuff with practitioners is definitely where we should be finding that evidence. Yeah.
Well, listen, Danny, I know your the day job means that you're at the end of term and you've got millions of students probably wanting to get your attention. So I'm conscious of time. So it seems like a good point where we can kind of bring this to a close. However, I'm not going to let you off the hook, because I know there's lots more we could talk about. So if you're willing to do a kind of part 2, possibly part 3, I'm sure people will want to hear from you again. Is that on the cards?
Yeah, no problem.
Cool.
My pleasure.
And go on.
My pleasure, Stu.
And in the meantime, hope all goes well with all the various things that are going on. And if people want to find out more about what you're doing and all that sort of stuff, is there anywhere they can go to find your stuff?
Yeah, Twitter's normally a good place. So at Danny Newcombe, it's normally on there. So everything we're kind of discussing and putting out, I tend to push out to there. Yeah, so yeah, check that out.
Yeah. Including self-congratulatory tweets about the success of the Welsh national team.
Yeah, it was good.
I do enjoy them. Anyway, listen, thanks for your time. I really appreciate you coming on and having a chat, and there's loads and loads of stuff in there, and I know it'll be interesting to an awful lot of people, so fully appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
See you later.
Bye.